Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into Operation Barbarossa, the massive German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. And let me tell you, this was a military campaign that hid a truly horrifying vision for the future of an entire continent.
So picture this, June 22nd, 1941. Over 3 million German soldiers storm across the Soviet border. It is, to this day, the largest land invasion in all of human history. But as the historian Adam Touzé points out, this was so much more than just a battle. This was a war driven by a radical colonial ideology.
And that really gets to the heart of it. How does a military operation become a plan for mass murder? To really get a grip on the sheer brutality of the Eastern Front, we're talking about a conflict that killed millions and millions of soldiers and civilians. We've got to look past the battle maps and into the ideology that was fueling the whole thing. All right, let's dive right in.
At its core, the invasion was all about a central Nazi idea that Hitler had been obsessed with for years, and that was the quest for Lebensraum, or living space. But don't let the name fool you. This wasn't about territory. It was about racial domination and economic theft on a scale that's, well, it's hard to even imagine.
Yeah, for years, Hitler had been crystal clear that Germany's destiny was in the East. The whole idea was to conquer these new territories, colonize them with Germans, and subjugate the people who already lived there, which in this case meant the Slavic populations. They were seen as being in the way.
And this is where things get really chilling. Think of it like this. There were two sets of plans. You had the official military one, Operation Barbarossa, which looked, on the surface, like a standard plan for a quick victory. But hiding just beneath that were these two other, far more sinister blueprints. And these weren't drawn up by generals. They were created by SS ideologues.
The first of these was called the Hunger Plan, and the goal was simple and brutal. Feed the entire German army and the folks back home using only food from the lands they just conquered. The plan calculated just cold as ice that to make this work, around 30 million Soviet citizens would have to be intentionally starved to death.
And if you think that's horrific, the long-term vision was even worse. That was called General Plan Ost, or General Plan East. This was the SS's master plan to completely re-engineer the racial makeup of Eastern Europe. It called for getting rid of, either through murder or deportation, up to 45 million Slavs over the next couple of decades, to make room for German settlers.
You know, you just have to listen to the man in charge, SS leader Heinrich Himmler, to really get the mindset. He flat out said it. The people living there weren't seen as human. They were just obstacles to be cleared away, or, at best, a source of slave labor. It's just chilling stuff. Okay, so let's hop over the border. While Germany is cooking up these genocidal plans, how was the Soviet Union getting ready for what was clearly an existential threat? Well, the short answer is they weren't. In fact, the Soviet leadership was about to make one of the biggest strategic blunders in all of history. Now you have to understand, Stalin wasn't in the dark here. Not at all. In the months leading up to the invasion, he was basically drowning in intelligence. He had his own spies deep inside the German command. He was getting direct warnings from Winston Churchill, who knew what was coming thanks to British code breakers. And I mean, you could literally see millions of German soldiers gathering right on his border.
So this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's what historians have been debating for decades. You have all this overwhelming evidence pointing to an absolute catastrophe. So why did Stalin just refuse to believe it?
Well, a huge piece of the puzzle was just pure paranoia. Stalin and his top diplomat, Molotov, were incredibly suspicious of the British. They saw Churchill's warnings not as a friendly tip-off, but as a trap, a trick to sucker them into a war with Germany that they knew they weren't ready for.
But it wasn't just paranoia. Stalin just couldn't get his head around his opponent. See, Stalin saw himself as a rational guy, and he figured Hitler must be too. He thought there was no way Hitler would make such a massive strategic mistake as opening a second front while still fighting Britain. So anytime evidence came in that contradicted that belief, he just ignored it. It's a textbook case of cognitive dissonance.
The tragic irony is that Stalin was planning for a war, just not this one. He was thinking of launching his own attack in a year or two once the Red Army was fully modernized. Instead, what he got was the absolute worst of both worlds. His army was pushed way too far forward to set up a good defense, but it was nowhere near ready to launch an attack of its own.
And then, at 3:30 in the morning on June 22nd, 1941, it happened. The invasion began. The largest land battle in history was on. And for a few terrifying months, It really felt like the fate of the entire world was hanging in the balance.
The German war machine, the Wehrmacht, just poured across the border. They unleashed their blitzkrieg tactics on a Red Army that was completely stunned and unprepared. You had this massive three-pronged attack, smashing through defenses with army groups north, center, and south, all aimed at the great cities: Leningrad, Moscow, and Kyiv.
The speed of it all was just breathtaking. I mean, in just 5 days, the Germans had pushed almost 300 miles deep to capture Minsk. By the middle of July, they were at Smolensk, which is basically the gateway to Moscow. All across this enormous front, entire Soviet armies were just being crushed and surrounded.
And the scale of the disaster for the Soviets it's just hard to wrap your head around. In one encirclement alone, the Bialystok-Minsk pocket, the Germans captured over 323,000 Soviet soldiers, not to mention thousands of tanks and guns. These were losses on a scale nobody had ever seen before.
So you can imagine, by the end of that summer, almost everyone in the West was writing off the Soviet Union for dead. The German military seemed completely unstoppable. It really looked like they were on the verge of a victory that would have changed the world forever.
But, and this is a huge but, this is where the whole story begins to flip on its head. Because underneath all of Germany's incredible success, those brilliant battlefield victories were hiding the seeds of their own destruction. The very nature of this war they were fighting meant they could never really win.
Look, don't get me wrong. Tactically, the German army's performance was masterful. But all that brilliance was built on a foundation of complete strategic madness. By choosing to fight a war of annihilation, they guaranteed that the Soviets would fight back with everything they had. There was no option to surrender, because the Soviet people knew they were fighting for their very existence.
And here's the thing about the Soviet Union. Even after that catastrophic start, it was uniquely built for this kind of total war. It had incredible strategic depth. It could just trade land for time. It could call on way more resources and manpower in the long run. So while Germany showed up ready for a quick sprint, the Soviet Union was prepared for a marathon, a bloody, brutal marathon that would eventually bleed the German army white.
And that leaves us with the big final question, doesn't it? Was the Soviet Union just too big and too tough to ever be conquered? Or did Germany lose the war the very moment it decided to make it a war of annihilation? I think the evidence really suggests that by mixing their military goals with a genocidal ideology, Germany sealed its own fate, turning what could have been a victory into a catastrophic, self-inflicted defeat.